The air in the Tactical Operations Center was thin and cold, tasting of dust and stale coffee. The frantic voice, screaming over the battalion net, cut through the low hum of computers and generators. All perimeter teams fall back to the Alamo. I repeat, fall back to the Alamo. The Alamo. The code word sent a jolt of pure ice water through the veins of every soldier who heard it. It meant the perimeter was compromised. It meant the fight was coming inside the wire. Through the thick, choking smoke rising from the shattered watchtower, a lone figure stood silhouetted against the hellish orange glow of the fire. Sergeant Eva Rostova was 22 years old, and in this moment she was utterly alone. Her hands, slick with a mixture of sweat and grime, gripped the cold, hard polymer of the M240B machine gun mounted on her Humvee. The weapon was silent, a dormant beast waiting for a command. Below her, the world had dissolved into chaos. The frantic cracks of M4 rifles were answered by the heavier, slower thump of enemy AK-47s. Men were shouting. Medics were screaming for corpsmen, and the base alarm wailed its relentless, panicked siren, a sound that clawed at the nerves. Her crew, Staff Sergeant Miller and Corporal Davis, were pinned down behind a stack of shredded HESCO barriers, their fields of fire blocked by the burning wreckage of a forklift. And then she saw it. The threat that made her blood run cold. A battered tan technical truck, its bed mounted with a brutish DSHK heavy machine gun, was accelerating toward the mangled remains of the main gate. Its gunner, a figure swathed in dark cloth, was swinging the long, menacing barrel toward Miller and Davis's position. They were completely exposed. In less than 10 seconds, that heavy machine gun would chew through the barriers and her crew with it. The base's survival, the lives of her brothers in arms, it all hinged on the next few heartbeats. And the only person who could act was the rookie driver, the girl they had all written off. Just hours before, Staff Sergeant Miller had laid out her role with a tone of weary patience. "Just keep the engine running, Rostova. We'll handle the hard stuff." The dismissal had been polite, professional, and absolute. She was the FNG, the freaking new guy, a fresh-faced sergeant straight out of Fort Hood, assigned to a crew of hardened veterans. She was just a driver, a piece of mobile logistics. They had seen a quiet, almost timid young woman. They had not seen the ghost living inside her, the legacy of a grandfather who had fought in a different war, in a different century. Now that ghost was screaming. The memory was so vivid it was paralyzing. The smell of gun oil and old wood in her grandfather's garage. His large, calloused hands guiding her small ones over the mechanism of his old Browning. "Precision, Malishka," he would whisper, his voice rough with a past he never fully explained. "This is not about killing. It is about protecting home. You respect the weapon, and it will respect you." She had buried that part of herself, this strange, anachronistic knowledge. She wanted to be judged on her own merits, not on the echoes of a war long ended. But here, surrounded by fire and failure, that echo was the only thing that made sense. The DSAK's barrel found its target. Miller met her eyes for a split second, his face a mask of grim resignation. He yelled something, but the words were lost in the explosion of another RPG hitting the motor pool. His mouth formed the words, "Stay down." Eva's body moved before her mind could protest. It was not a conscious decision. It was muscle memory older than she was. She released the safety latch, her fingers finding the charging handle with an instinct she didn't know she possessed. She pulled and released. The heavy metallic clunk-clunk of the bolt seating around was the most comforting and terrifying sound she had ever heard. The beast was awake. The technical was 50 meters out, its engine roaring. The gunner saw her. His eyes widened and he began to traverse his weapon toward her. Eva Rostova, the rookie, took a deep breath, exhaled half of it, and leaned into the gun. The world shrank to the space between her eye and the gun's sight. The roaring chaos of the battle, the shriek of the alarm, the frantic shouts, it all faded into a dull, distant hum. There was only the target. The technical's grill filled her vision. Her grandfather's voice was calm and clear in her mind, as if he were standing right beside her in the turret. "Do not panic, Malishka. The weapon knows what to do. You must simply guide it." She squeezed the trigger. The M240B erupted to life, its deafening rhythmic roar a physical force that shook the entire Humvee. Brass casings spewed from the ejection port, clinking and spinning as they hit the armored door below. A stream of red tracer rounds cut a brilliant, deadly line through the swirling dust and smoke. Her first burst was high, chewing into the Technical's windshield. She adjusted her stance, leaning harder into the weapon, controlling its powerful dance. The second burst walked straight into the engine block. Steam and smoke billowed from the hood. The truck swerved violently. The enemy gunner, thrown off balance, fired his DSHK. The heavy rounds went wide, stitching a line of geysers in the dirt 10 feet to the left of her crew's position. Miller and Davis ducked, their faces pressed into the gravel. Eva kept firing. She was no longer just a sergeant in the U.S. Army. She was her grandfather's granddaughter. She was the keeper of his ghost. A third, longer burst from her gun found its mark. The Technical's radiator exploded in a cloud of white vapor. The vehicle lurched, its front axle seizing, and skidded to a grinding halt. But the fight wasn't over. Muzzle flashes sparked from a ruined storage container 20 meters to the right of the disabled truck. Two insurgents with rifles were using the wreckage for cover, trying to flank the main entrance. Eva traversed the turret, the gears groaning in protest. She was a conductor of chaos. She laid down a suppressing burst, the bullets pinging and ricocheting off the metal container, forcing the enemy to keep their heads down. She was creating breathing room. She was holding the line. Down below, Miller seized the opportunity. He tapped Davis on the helmet, gesturing furiously. While Eva kept the enemy pinned, they low-crawled to a better, more defensible position behind a concrete barrier. Davis provided covering fire with his M4, while Miller shouldered an AT-4 rocket launcher. He rose, took a knee, and aimed at the stationary Technical. The rocket whooshed away, striking the vehicle square in the side. The secondary explosion was immense. The DSHK's ammunition cooked off in a spectacular display of popping lights and shrapnel, utterly destroying the truck and silencing its gun forever. The ferocity of the counter-assault broke the enemy's momentum. The incoming rifle fire became sporadic, then ceased altogether. An eerie, ringing silence descended, broken only by the crackle of the burning watchtower and the relentless, stupid wail of the alarm. The smoke began to slowly drift away on the evening breeze. Eva's fingers were locked around the grips of the machine gun. Her shoulders ached. The barrel of the M240B smoked, glowing a faint cherry red in the dimming light. She took a shuddering breath, the scent of cordite and burnt metal filling her lungs. She became aware of the stunned faces of the engineers and medics who had witnessed her stand. Then she looked down. Staff Sergeant Miller was staring up at her. The soot on his face was streaked with sweat. The dismissive professionalism, the casual condescension was gone. It had been burned away in the fire of the last 90 seconds. His expression was one of raw, unvarnished shock, which slowly melted into a profound, bedrock respect. He didn't smile. He didn't give a thumbs up. He simply held her gaze and nodded. It was a slow, deliberate gesture from one warrior to another. It was all that needed to be said. The rookie was gone. In her place stood Sergeant Eva Rostova, a soldier. The silence after the battle was a heavy, living thing. It was broken by the crackle of flames and the distant, urgent calls of medics, but the frantic shooting had stopped. Eva's hands were frozen to the grips of the machine gun. Her knuckles were white, locked in a rigor of adrenaline and fear. The metal of the gun was searingly hot, the heat bleeding through her gloves, but she couldn't seem to let go. The smell was what struck her most powerfully, the acrid, electric tang of spent cordite, the greasy smoke from burning rubber and fuel, and beneath it all, the faint, metallic scent of blood. Slowly, carefully, she peeled her fingers away from the weapon. Her whole body began to tremble, a fine, uncontrollable shaking that started deep in her core and radiated out to her limbs. She became aware of the stairs. A group of engineers, their faces smudged with dirt and exhaustion, had stopped what they were doing. They weren't staring at the destroyed Technical or the burning watchtower. They were staring at her. Their looks were not of pity or dismissal, but of a kind of awestruck curiosity. She had been part of the landscape an hour ago, invisible. Now she was the focal point. A movement below broke the spell. Staff Sergeant Miller climbed onto the running board of the Humvee, his movements slow and deliberate. He didn't speak at first. He simply looked from her face, pale and streaked with grime, to the smoking barrel of the M240B, and then back to her face. His eyes, which had always held a weary patience for her, now held something else entirely, a deep, recalculating respect. "Rostova," he said, his voice hoarse from shouting and smoke. It wasn't a question. It was an acknowledgement. I saw the truck," she managed, her own voice a thin, unfamiliar whisper. "It was going to flank you." "I know," he said, his gaze intense. "I saw it too. I just didn't have a shot." He paused, his eyes searching hers. "Where did you learn to fire a 240 like that?" "That wasn't qual-range fire. That was surgical." Eva looked away, her eyes drifting over the devastation in the compound. How could she explain? How could she put into words the countless afternoons in her grandfather's garage, the smell of Hoppa's No. 9 solvent, the weight of history in his hands as he taught her? It sounded like a fairy tale, a lie a frightened rookie would tell to sound important. Before she could form an answer, the moment was shattered by the approach of the Quick Reaction Force. Soldiers in full kit fanned out, securing the area. A medic rushed over to check on Davis, who was nursing a shallow cut on his forehead from flying debris. The spell was broken. The battle was over, but the aftermath was just beginning. The company first sergeant, a grizzled man named Williams, strode up to their vehicle. His eyes took in the scene. The spent brass pooled around the Humvee like a golden carpet. The glowing gun barrel. The destroyed technical still burning 50 meters away. "Miller!" First Sergeant Williams barked. "What in God's name happened at this gate?" Miller didn't hesitate. He didn't glance at Eva for confirmation. He stood a little straighter. "First Sergeant, the perimeter was overrun. We were pinned. They had a technical with a dushka aimed right at us. Sergeant Rostova," he said, emphasizing her rank, "manned the turret and engaged. She neutralized the vehicle and suppressed enemy positions, allowing us to reposition and destroy the target. She held this gate, First Sergeant." "Sir." First Sergeant Williams' sharp eyes shifted from Miller to Eva, who was still standing in the turret, looking more like a scared kid than a hero. He looked at the gun, then back at her face. He gave a slow, single nod, a carbon copy of the one Miller had given her minutes before. "All right," the First Sergeant said, his tone all business. "Rostova, you're with me. The old man wants a debrief now." He turned to Miller. "Get this vehicle secured. I want a full after-action report on my desk in 2 hours." Eva numbly climbed down from the turret. Her legs felt like rubber. As her boots hit the ground, Miller reached out and gently touched her arm, stopping her for a second. "Hey," he said, his voice low. "Just tell them what you did." "Nothing more, nothing less," she nodded, unable to speak. As she walked away, following the First Sergeant toward the Tactical Operations Center, she could feel the eyes of the entire base on her. The invisible rookie was gone forever. What came next, she had no idea. The inside of the Tactical Operations Center was a different world. The air was cold and processed, smelling of ozone and stale coffee. Banks of monitors glowed with maps and drone feeds, their light a stark contrast to the fiery chaos outside. The frantic energy was gone, replaced by a tense, focused hum. Soldiers spoke in low, clipped tones into headsets. Every eye in the room turned to her as she entered behind First Sergeant Williams. Whispers trailed in her wake. "That's her. The driver. The one on the 240. They stopped before a door marked Battalion CDR. Williams knocked once and entered without waiting for a reply. The room was small, dominated by a large table covered in maps. The battalion commander, a colonel with graying hair and a face etched with the weight of command, looked up from a satellite image. His eyes, sharp and assessing, immediately locked onto Eva. Next to him stood the command sergeant major, a man whose very posture seemed to be carved from granite. "Sir, this is Sergeant Rostova," Williams said. The colonel stood. "Sergeant." He didn't offer a hand. His gaze was intense, dissecting. "First Sergeant Williams tells me you just performed a one-woman counter-assault on the main gate. Is that accurate?" Eva stood at parade rest, her heart hammering against her ribs. "Sir, I engaged the enemy from my vehicle's turret." "Tell me," he commanded, his voice calm but leaving no room for hesitation. "From the beginning." "What did you see?" She took a shallow breath. She could feel the command sergeant major's silent stare. "We returned from the logistics run, sir. The first RPG hit the watchtower. Then the second. My crew dismounted to engage. I saw a technical truck approaching the main gate from the east. It was armed with a heavy machine gun. It was preparing to engage my crew, who were pinned behind the HESCO barriers. "Why didn't you take cover?" the sergeant major asked, his voice a low rumble. "Sergeant Major, the gunner was traversing his weapon toward Staff Sergeant Miller and Corporal Davis. They were in a crossfire. There was no time." The colonel's expression didn't change. "So you mounted the turret. Your training kicked in?" This was the moment. Miller's words echoed in her mind. "Just tell them what you did." But the truth was more complicated. "Sir, not exactly." The two senior leaders exchanged a glance. She pressed on, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "My grandfather. He was a soldier. In the Second World War, he taught me about machine guns, how to handle them, how to respect them. It was what I knew how to do." She expected skepticism, disbelief. Instead, the colonel's intense stare softened by a fraction. A flicker of understanding passed between him and the sergeant major. "The Browning," the sergeant major said, not as a question, but a statement. "Your fire was controlled, disciplined. You aimed for the engine block. You didn't spray and pray. That's not what they teach on the qualification range." "Yes, Sergeant Major," Eva said, surprised he had discerned that from the chaos. The colonel leaned forward, his hands flat on the table. "Sergeant Rostova, you acted with initiative and courage that is far beyond your pay grade and experience. You prevented a significant breach of this base. You saved American lives today. Do you understand that?" The words landed with a physical weight. She had been focused on the immediate threat, on the technical, on her crew. She hadn't allowed herself to think of the bigger picture, of what would have happened if that truck had gotten through the gate. A cold dread, delayed by adrenaline, trickled down her spine. "I understand, sir." "Good," the colonel said. "We will be putting you in for a commendation. The paperwork starts now. First sergeant, see that she gets a hot meal and gets her statement. Dismissed." As she turned to leave, the command sergeant major spoke again. "Sergeant," she stopped. "Your grandfather," he said. "He'd be proud." The simple words struck her with more force than the colonel's promise of a medal. She nodded, her throat too tight to speak, and followed First Sergeant Williams back out into the humming operations center. The stares were different now. They were no longer just looks of curiosity. They were looks of respect. She had walked in as a question mark. She was walking out as a soldier who had passed the only test that truly mattered. The walk from the TOC to the chow hall was the longest of Eva's life. The sun had fully set, casting the base in the eerie, artificial orange glow of sodium vapor lights. The air still carried the sour smell of smoke and explosives. Every soldier she passed seemed to look at her, their glances lingering a moment too long. A few gave her a slow, deliberate nod. Others just stared, their expressions unreadable. She felt exposed, her skin prickling under the weight of their attention. The silence from her crew was a gnawing void. She had no idea what Miller and Davis truly thought now that the adrenaline had faded. She pushed open the heavy door to the chow hall. The familiar, greasy smell of hot food hit her, a bizarrely normal scent in the aftermath of chaos. The low rumble of conversation dipped for a second as she entered. Heads turned. She kept her eyes fixed straight ahead, moving toward the serving line with a forced calm she did not feel. A tray was shoved into her hands. "On the house, Sergeant." The civilian contractor behind the counter, a large man named Gus, who usually had a gruff word for everyone, gave her a wide grin. "Heard you gave those bastards a hell of a welcome party." He piled an extra scoop of mashed potatoes onto her plate. She managed a weak smile, her cheeks burning. "Thanks, Gus." Finding a seat was her next challenge. She scanned the crowded tables, looking for an empty spot where she could be alone. Then she saw them. Miller and Davis were sitting at their usual table in the corner. Davis had a bandage on his forehead. Miller was staring into a cup of coffee. They hadn't seen her yet. Her feet felt rooted to the floor. This was the moment she had been dreading. The debrief with the colonel was one thing. This was another. Taking a deep breath, she walked toward them. The chatter at the surrounding tables seemed to hush as she approached. Davis saw her first. He stopped talking mid-sentence, his eyes widening slightly. Miller looked up. His expression was still unreadable, but the dismissive impatience was gone. There was a new, cautious gravity in his face. The empty chair between them felt like a chasm. "Mind if I sit?" Ava asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Miller pushed the chair out with his boot. "It's your table too, Rostova." She sat, the plastic chair creaking under her weight. For a long moment, no one spoke. The clatter of cutlery and the hum of the generators filled the space between them. Ava poked at her food, her appetite gone. Davis was the one who broke the silence. He leaned forward, a boyish grin spreading across his face. "Holy hell, Rostova. That was the most insane thing I've ever seen. You were like John Wayne up there!" He shook his head in disbelief. "When that Dushka started swinging toward us, I thought we were toast, completely toasted." Eva looked from Davis's enthusiastic face to Miller's silent, contemplative one. "I just did what needed doing," she said softly. Finally, Miller spoke. He didn't look at her, but kept his eyes on his coffee cup. "I was wrong," he said, the words simple and direct. "I had you pegged as a liability. A green kid we had to babysit." He finally lifted his gaze to meet hers. His eyes were tired, but clear. "That wasn't luck today. That was skill. I've been in this army for 12 years, and I've never seen fire control like that under pressure. Wherever you learned that, thank you." The sincerity in his voice undid her. The last of her nervous tension began to seep away, replaced by a weary, profound relief. They didn't hate her. They didn't resent her. They accepted her. Davis nudged her with his elbow. "So what's the deal? You some secret spec ops sniper or something?" Ava gave a small, genuine smile for the first time since the attack. "Or something," she said. "My grandfather." Miller nodded slowly, as if a puzzle piece had finally clicked into place. "It figures. That kind of cool doesn't come from a manual." He pushed his coffee cup aside. "All right, listen. From now on, you're not just the driver. You're part of this crew. For real. You're on the gun anytime we're outside the wire. Understood?" It wasn't a question. It was an order, and it was the greatest honor she had ever received. "Understood, Staff Sergeant," she said. Davis raised his water bottle. "To the rookie," he said, a wide grin on his face. "Who ain't a rookie anymore?" Miller picked up his coffee cup and clinked it against Davis's bottle, then looked at Eva until she raised her own. The three of them sat there in the noisy chow hall, a crew that had been fractured, now forged into something stronger by fire. The ghost in the garage had finally found its home. The next 3 weeks were a transformation. The base, scarred and patched up, returned to its tense rhythm of patrols and logistics runs. But for Eva, everything was different. She was no longer Sergeant Rostova, the FNG. She was Rostova, the gunner. When their Humvee rolled out the main gate, she was in the turret, her hands resting on the grips of the M240B, her eyes constantly scanning the treacherous landscape of the green zone. The crew's dynamic had shifted into a seamless, professional harmony. Miller would call out potential threats over the intercom, his voice calm and focused. Davis, now riding shotgun, would scan his sector. And Eva, perched above them, was their guardian, her presence a quiet reassurance. The trust was absolute. On a resupply mission to a remote combat outpost, their convoy was hit by a complex ambush. Insurgents opened up from a tree line and a nearby compound. Before Miller could even give the order, Eva had already traversed the turret, her bursts of fire precise and punishing. She suppressed the tree line, allowing the truck behind them to maneuver to safety. Then, without hesitation, she laid down a steady stream of covering fire on the compound, her tracers walking right up to the firing ports, forcing the enemy to keep their heads down while a squad of infantry flanked the position. She worked in perfect concert with her crew, a single efficient instrument of war. There was no fear anymore, only a hyper-focused calm. This was what she was meant to do. One evening, after a long and dusty patrol, Miller found her cleaning the M240B in the motor pool. The weapon was laid out on a canvas tarp, each part meticulously wiped and oiled. He watched her for a moment. The way her hands moved with a practiced, almost reverent care. you know, he said, leaning against the Humvee's tire. I put you in for a commendation. The Army Commendation Medal with Valor device. Eva looked up, a cleaning rod in her hand. You didn't have to do that, Staff Sergeant. Yeah, I did, he replied, his tone leaving no room for argument. What you did wasn't just saving our asses, Rostova. It was textbook valor under fire. The old man approved it this morning. There's going to be a ceremony when the general visits next week. A medal. The concept felt distant and abstract, something that happened to other people, to heroes in stories. She looked down at the disassembled machine gun, the cold, hard steel gleaming under the work light. This felt more real. This was her tribute. The way you handle that weapon, Miller continued, nodding toward the gun. It's not just training. It's like it's a part of you. Your grandfather. He'd be proud. A wave of emotion, sudden and sharp, tightened her throat. She focused on scrubbing a speck of carbon from the bolt carrier. He never talked much about what he did, she said softly. Just that he fought from Normandy to Germany. He said the gun was a terrible tool, but sometimes it was the only thing standing between your home and the darkness. He said you never fire it in anger. You fire it to make the anger stop. Miller was silent for a long moment. The sounds of the motor pool, the distant hum of a generator, the clang of a tool, filled the space between them. He was right, Miller said finally. We forget that sometimes. We get so wrapped up in the mission, the metrics, we forget what we're really protecting. He pushed himself off the tire. Get some chow, Rostova. Big day tomorrow. After he left, Eva remained, putting the machine gun back together. The pieces slid into place with satisfying clicks and clunks. As she tightened the final barrel nut, she felt a profound sense of connection. She wasn't just assembling a weapon. She was honoring a legacy. The ghost in the garage was no longer a secret shame, a part of herself she had to hide. It was her foundation. It was her strength. She was no longer just a soldier carrying out orders. She was a guardian, standing on the shoulders of a generation that had faced a different kind of darkness, but for the very same reasons. The line she held now was drawn from a frozen field in Europe to the dusty perimeter of an air base in Afghanistan, and she would hold it with the same steadfast resolve. The morning of the ceremony dawned clear and bright, the sky a hard, brilliant blue that seemed to mock the memory of the smoke and fire. The air was still cool, carrying the scent of dust and diesel. The entire battalion was formed up on the hot concrete of the parade ground, standing in neat, crisp rows in their desert camouflage. The American flag and the unit colors hung limp in the still air. There was a formality to the event that felt both alien and deeply significant. This wasn't the chaotic, desperate heroism of the battlefield. This was the Army's ancient, structured way of saying thank you. Eva stood at the position of parade rest, her heart thumping a slow, heavy rhythm against her ribs. She was in the front row, acutely aware of the hundreds of eyes on her back. To her left stood Miller, his posture ramrod straight, his face an unreadable mask of military bearing. To her right was Davis, who couldn't seem to stop a small, proud smile from playing on his lips. The Humvee crew, once fractured, now stood as a united front. A hush fell over the formation as the command party arrived. The battalion commander and the command sergeant major were there, but leading them was a man Eva had only ever seen in pictures on the unit walls. A two-star general, his uniform adorned with ribbons, his expression stern and dignified. The ceremony began with the usual formalities, the reporting, the salute to the colors. It felt like it took an eternity. Eva's mind drifted, the formal words blending into the memory of her grandfather's voice. Precision, Malishka! She could almost feel his large, work-roughened hand on her shoulder. Then, the battalion commander spoke her name. Sergeant Eva Rostova, front and center. The command snapped her back to the present. She took a deep, steadying breath, took 3 sharp paces forward, did a flawless about-face, and marched toward the general and the colonel. Her boots echoed on the concrete, each step a drumbeat marking the end of one life and the beginning of another. She stopped before them, saluting sharply. The general returned the salute, his eyes appraising her. He was older, his face lined with the maps of a long career. He took the small, velvet-lined box from an aide. The colonel began to read the citation, his voice projecting across the silent formation. For meritorious service and valor in the face of an armed enemy attack on Bagram Airfield. With complete disregard for her own safety, Sergeant Rostova mounted an exposed vehicle turret and engaged a numerically superior enemy force. Her precise and disciplined fire neutralized a key enemy vehicle and suppressed multiple enemy positions, directly preventing a breach of the base perimeter and saving the lives of numerous coalition soldiers. The words washed over her, formal and grand. They were describing something that felt both like her and not like her at all. It had been so loud, so chaotic, so driven by instinct. To hear it distilled into the clean, sterile language of a citation was surreal. The colonel finished. The general took a step forward, the medal in his hand. "Sergeant Rostova," he said, his voice quieter now, meant only for her. "The Army talks a lot about courage and initiative. We put it on posters. We preach it in basic training. But it's soldiers like you who define it. You saw a gap in our defense, and you filled it with skill and raw courage. Your actions embody the finest traditions of military service." He pinned the medal to her uniform. The weight of it, a small bronze star with a V device, was surprisingly heavy on her chest. It felt like an anchor. He rendered a final, crisp salute. "The nation is in your debt, Sergeant." Ava returned the salute, her arm sharp and sure. "Thank you, sir." As she executed another about-face to return to her formation, the battalion commander barked, "Battalion! At den hut!" The sound of hundreds of boots snapping together was like a single crack of thunder. Then, the command sergeant major's voice boomed across the parade ground. "Present arms!" In a single, synchronized, and breathtakingly powerful motion, every single soldier in the battalion raised their hand in a salute to her. It was a forest of raised arms, a silent, thunderous tribute from her peers, from the veterans, from the entire command. It was a recognition that went far beyond a piece of metal and ribbon. It was acceptance. It was respect. It was belonging. As she marched back to her place, her eyes met Miller's. He held his salute, his gaze steady and proud. The rookie was gone forever. In her place was a warrior, recognized not just by her commanders, but by the only family that mattered in this dusty, distant place. Her own. The final chapter of her deployment felt different. The dust was the same, the heat was the same, the ever-present tension was the same. But Ava was not. The weight of the medal in her small personal effects box was less significant than the new weight she carried on her shoulders, the weight of trust. She was no longer just a soldier. She was a proven asset, a calm center in the chaos. When new replacements arrived, wide-eyed and nervous, it was she who often showed them the ropes. It was she who demonstrated the quickest way to clear a jam in the M240B. It was she who sat with them in the chow hall when they looked lost, offering a quiet word of reassurance. The ghost in the garage had become a guide. The day their rotation ended was a blur of medical checks, equipment turn-in, and a frantic, joyful packing of duffel bags. The flight out of Bagram was a silent affair, each soldier lost in their own thoughts, staring out the window as the rugged, unforgiving landscape of Afghanistan gave way to endless blue sky, and then, finally, to the lush green order of Germany. And then, home. The gymnasium at Fort Hood was a cacophony of screaming families, waving flags, and crying children. The air was thick with the smell of patriotism and anticipation. Ava stood in formation, her duffel bag at her feet, scanning the crowd. And then she saw them. Her mother, clutching a small American flag, tears already streaming down her face. And next to her, standing straighter than she had seen him in years, was her grandfather. He wore his old veteran's cap, his hands clasped tightly behind his back, his eyes searching the rows of identical desert camouflage until they found hers. When the commander dismissed them, the formation dissolved into a happy, chaotic mob of reunions. Ava pushed her way through, her duffel bag bumping against her legs. Her mother enveloped her in a crushing hug, sobbing into her shoulder. "My baby, you're home, you're safe." Over her mother's shoulder, Eva looked at her grandfather. His eyes, the same clear blue as her own, were glistening with unshed tears. He didn't say a word. He simply opened his arms. She stepped into his embrace, feeling the thin, frail strength of him. He held her for a long moment, his hand patting her back gently. When he finally pulled away, he held her at arm's length, his gaze traveling from her face down to her uniform. As if searching for something, he saw it then, tucked subtly into her pocket, the red, white, and blue ribbon of the award she had worn only once at the ceremony. His eyes lingered on it, and a deep, profound understanding passed between them. It wasn't the medal itself. It was what it represented. It was the validation of every lesson in that dusty garage, of every story he had told her about duty and sacrifice. He had given her a legacy, and she had carried it across the world and brought it home, honor intact. He finally spoke, his voice a soft, raspy whisper that was almost lost in the noise of the gym. "You held the line, Malishka." It was all he needed to say. The words closed a circle that had begun decades ago on a different continent, in a different war. The ghost was no longer a ghost. It was a living bond, a thread of courage passed from one generation to the next. She had gone to war to prove herself to her unit, but she had ended up proving something to the man who had made her who she was. She was Sergeant Eva Rostova, a soldier, and she was finally home.